Well, alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Gutowski Files, starring Stephen Gutowski. He is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the Weekly Reload podcast, and he's from Philly.
Wilderness Tactical has been around for longer than the gun you're carrying has been, and they have been making high-quality products for concealed carriers for literally decades. I wear their low pro belt every year. The webbing is the best in the industry, and I won't wear anything else. If you're looking for a good CCW belt, check them out.
Anyway, some good news and bad news. We record this. It is Monday, October 16th, 2023, and the Eagles are no longer undefeated. However, to make that go down a little easier, the Phillies are opening up their championship series tonight against the Diamondbacks. So who knows? Who knows how his day will end up. That's correct.
I'm switching into Red October mode here. So, the Eagles played on Sunday. That it was yesterday. Today is Monday. We have the NLCS first game at home. We're recording this today in part, I don't think I told you this, but in part because I'm probably going to go to that second game up in Philly.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be expensive, but I don't need to go on vacation this year. I'll just do this instead.
Yeah. Well, you got to do it at some point. I think people who watch the channel or follow John's socials will know that John Correa just not long ago got to take his mom, who's in failing health, to a 49ers game, a preseason game. So that was a lot of fun. Yeah. And I'm going to a Commanders-Rams game in LA later this year. Who knows how that'll turn out? But
that probably won't be as fun. But
yeah. Okay.
Their stadium's cool, though.
Yeah, I get to see SoFi, so that'll be a lot of fun. All right, now we've completely turned off all the non-sports people. So moving on, we'll talk about some gun stuff.
We'll transition this into the Supreme Court's gun case.
Yeah,
transition. Figure out what that's going to be.
Which is just as exciting as any baseball game. So what we're talking about this week is something that we've talked about at least in passing before, which is there is a case, I believe it's out of Texas, involving a defendant named Rahimi. It's a domestic violence case. It was the nexus for it. And the gist of the case is basically to have the Supreme Court sort out, how I look at it anyway, sort out, hey, can we, what are the processes and what are the rules around someone who is accused of domestic violence, who has a restraining order, as far as their firearms go. And, this stuff now is all, it has to be looked at through a different lens because of Bruin and some other cases. So, Stephen, for those who don't know much about the case, kind of just real briefly walk us through how the case started and why it should matter to other people who own firearms.
Yeah, certainly. So Bruin kind of created a whole slew of new questions. There's really three big important ones, and that's, who can be restricted from owning firearms, how can they be restricted, in what way, disarmed or required to get a permit or pay a fee or something like that, and then what guns can be restricted, what kind of firearms can be restricted from public use. So obviously things like assault weapons bans and magazine limits would fall into that last category, but this one is obviously a who case. Who can be restricted from owning firearms? And that's where Zachary Rahimi comes in. He's accused of quite a lot of things. He's not a very upstanding member of society, I would say. I don't think anyone on either side has any illusions about that.
Right.
But that's often the case with Supreme Court defendants, especially criminal defendants.
Well, look at Miranda. I mean, that's a perfect example. Yeah. He was not a nice person, but, his name is forever famous in law enforcement circles.
Right. And so the questions deal with principles that will apply to everybody, whether or not the named defendant is a good guy. And honestly, this guy, Rahimi, will probably have his gun rights taken away regardless of the outcome of this case, because he's accused of several crimes that he's being prosecuted for right now that would be felonies that would make him a prohibited person.
Some of those are gun crimes, correct? Some of those are gun crimes, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. He was accused of a number of gun crimes, a number of shootings, drug-related crimes. He pulled out a gun and shot in the air at a Whataburger because his friend's card was declined. That's one of the accusations in the cases against him.
Should have gone in and out. He wouldn't have that problem. Sorry, bad joke.
There you go. But yeah, so and that's why actually his home was searched. The case is a result of a search that police did on his home after this other incident, sort of a spree of crimes that this guy is accused of going on that include like running people off the road, shooting at them, drug deal related shootings, and then obviously the Whataburger incident that all led police to searching this guy's house, and they found a gun, which was also it's almost comical in some senses. They found a gun which was apparently in a similar part of the house as the domestic violence restraining order that this guy was subject to, which under current law, it's illegal for somebody subject to a domestic violence restraining order to possess firearms. So they kind of found these things right next to each other, and they charged him with that, and he was convicted. And so he's challenging that conviction. And he had a domestic violence restraining order issued against him because a judge found that he was dangerous, that he had committed an act of violence against the mother of his child, and then threatened somebody else as well with a firearm. I think he shot at them. Is the facts of the case, the background here. But he wasn't convicted on those crimes. This was part of the finding by a judge in a domestic violence restraining order that he was, that was issued against him.
Right.
And so the question in the case deals with whether this federal law that says people who are subject to these sorts of restraining orders that have to do with domestic violence is constitutional under the Second Amendment. Like, can you actually disarm somebody who's subject to one of these restraining orders? And this week at the Reload, we had a couple of different takes on this. We've been obviously reporting on this case since it was accepted. And it's actually, the oral arguments are going to begin next month in this case. So it's moving fairly quickly, and we might get a decision in it earlier than normal. Normally, the controversial cases that the court delivers come out in June, but this one, we might see it in January or something like that. Depends on how fast it moves. Hard to predict, but
sure.
Regardless, we've looked at a lot of the arguments in the case. We've done pieces on the government's brief, where essentially a lot of their argument boils down to the idea that Rahimi is not a law-abiding person, and therefore, because of the history and tradition of disarming people who aren't considered to be law-abiding, this law that disarms him is constitutional. That's sort of the government's argument. It's obviously a lot more in depth than that, but that's kind of the baseline that they're going with, because the Supreme Court in its previous gun cases has talked a lot about law abiding, because most of those cases dealt with people who weren't accused of any crimes having their gun rights restricted anyway.
Right.
And so a lot of the court's wording in those cases talks about how law abiding people have a right to self-defense, and it goes on at length about that. And so the government is sort of picking up on that language and saying, well, Rahimi's not law-abiding, right? So, if you look with a broad enough vision at the past and the history that the court considers for whether or not a gun law is constitutional, well, law-abiding people have been disarmed in the past, in the founding era, in some ways. People who didn't take loyalty oaths, or people like that. A lot of it is loyalty oath stuff, to be honest. But and that's what they point to and say, well, with this broad view, people who aren't law-abiding can't own a gun. You could take away their firearms. And on the other hand, you've got Rahimi, the defendant, arguing essentially that that's way too broad of a view.
Well, yeah, I mean,
there really isn't a history of disarming people over domestic violence accusations in something like a restraining order from historical times.
Yeah, and it just, people will accuse me, I'm sure, of parsing words or splitting hairs or something like that. But you have to consider the language in these things is very important. What does law-abiding mean? Excuse me. And you and I talked about this earlier. We talked about it before here on the show. I'm pretty sure, we all generally understand what we mean when we say law abiding. We mean, generally speaking, you follow the law, you pay your taxes, you don't drive excessively fast, you don't, punch people in the face for no reason. But if you get, again, I always say, if you're, if you're involved in a critical encounter, for example, and you use a firearm or any weapon for that matter, but especially a firearm, the way you're going to be treated and whether or not you're going to be charged comes down to a lot of factors. But some of those factors are intangibles, like how does the investigating detective or agent feel about people in general having firearms on their person? How does the prosecutor feel about it? How does the prosecutor's boss feel about the Second Amendment? And so when it comes to law abiding, I mean, if you go to Costco and you get past the guy at the door checking your receipt and you get to your card and realize, oh no, there's a bottle of aspirin at the bottom of my cart that I forgot to pay for, you've committed theft. Every definition of theft, you've committed theft, whether you meant to or not. So are you now not law abiding, even though you ran back inside, and said, hey, I forgot to pay for this?